Welcome to this presentation on Indian Americans' views on India. This is the second of three reports based on Indian American attitudes survey that was done in September last year. And this is joint work with Dr. Milind Vaishnav of the Carnegie Endowment, Sumitra Badrinathan of the University of Pennsylvania, and myself. Before we get started, I just wanted to thank my colleagues, Professor Josh White, Sonia Holmes, Pedro, and Long Luo for helping to put this event together. We'll first begin with a presentation of the key findings by Milind. I'll then follow up with some broad implications. We'll then open up to your questions, and Sumitra will answer all the hard ones. So now it's over to you, Milind.
Thanks very much, Devesh. I am going to just put on a presentation here, if you bear with me. Okay, hopefully you can all see that now. It's great to be with you. Thank you so much to Johns Hopkins SAIS. Thank you to my colleagues, Devesh and Sumitra. Thanks also to two people who are hopefully listening in somewhere, Jonathan Kay and Tobin Hansen, who were instrumental in analyzing the data that went into this research that we're going to talk about today. And thanks also to our partners at YouGov who helped us conduct this survey. Let me start with a couple of words about why we're here today. Many of you will know that Prime Minister Modi and his government have made outreach to the Indian diaspora a core pillar of India's foreign policy. Nowhere has this, I think, been more evident than in the United States, which of course is home to one of the largest and most influential of the Indian diasporas, which now straddle almost 200 countries around the world. Modi came out with a big bang in 2014 when he addressed a crowd of 18,000 people at Madison Square Garden in New York City, which had the feel really, I think, of a post-election sort of victory lap. More recently, of course, in the fall of 2019, 50,000 Indian Americans flooded a football stadium in Houston, Texas to celebrate Narendra Modi at what became known as the Howdy Modi rally. This was a pretty unprecedented rally in which, the US President, Donald Trump, seen here in this picture, was the sort of opening act for the headliner, Narendra Modi. Now, as the throngs were chanting pro-Modi and pro-India slogans, celebrating India's achievements inside the arena, hundreds, if not thousands, of protesters, many of whom were Indian American, were outside the arena, chanting slogans about the demise of Indian democracy, chanting slogans shouting down the prime minister. And so to us, this really begs the question of, how do Indian Americans relate to their ancestral homeland of India? What are their views on the political and social changes underway there? And what sort of future do they envision for the relations between the United States and India going forward? Those of you who joined us in October of last year may have heard this before, but this is part of a new initiative that our three organizations got together to launch, which was really meant to try to harness new empirical data that can characterize the views, attitudes, and preferences of Indian Americans on a broad range of subjects. We did this through a unique survey known as the 2020 IAAS, or the Indian American Attitude Survey. This is a nationwide, nationally representative survey of 1,200 US adult residents who are Indian Americans. This here was the cover of our October 2020 report, which really focused narrowly on the questions of the political attitudes in an American context of the Indian American population. This, of course, was in advance of the 2020 US presidential election. What we're going to talk about today are the findings of our second report, which we released this morning, which is, again, using that data from these 1,200 Indian Americans to ask the question, how do Indian Americans connect to and view changes underway in India? As Devesh mentioned in his introduction, this is part 2 of a 3-part series. The third and final part, which we hope to release later this spring in April or May, will look at how Indian Americans relate to one another. What are their social realities, their immigration experience? How do they view one another living in the United States? So if you're interested in this work, we hope that you'll stay tuned and continue to follow along for part 3 due in a couple of months. What I'm going to do today is go over 7 questions that kind of orient our report. Number 1, how do the bonds of kinship and citizenship shape Indian Americans' connections back home to India? Number 2, what personal and cultural outlets do Indian Americans pursue to try to remain engaged in India? Number 3, how do they assess the state of democracy in India? And how closely are they following politics? To what extent do they have a favored political party or partisan identity, again, in an Indian context as opposed to an American context? Number 5, how do Indian Americans view contentious policy debates underway in India? Are their views similar or different to how they view those same issues in an American context? Number 6, what sources do Indian Americans rely upon to remain informed about what's happening back home in India? And last but not least, how do they view US-India relations and US efforts to lend diplomatic support to India? So I'm gonna, with your forbearance, try to make it through these 7 questions, but look forward to your comments and questions during the Q&A portion. Let me just quickly say a word about methodology. This survey, as we've said already a couple of times, was conducted with YouGov in the month of September in 2020. The overall sample size is 1,200 US adult residents. YouGov sits on a proprietary panel of almost 2 million US residents who are enrolled in their surveys. From that larger sample, we extracted a sample of Indian Americans. YouGov uses a pretty sophisticated sample matching and weighting mechanism to ensure that our sample is broadly representative, of the Indian American population at large. They do that by weighting the sample to the 2018 American Community Survey, which is a survey carried out by the US Census Bureau. The overall margin of error is plus or minus 2.8%. So keep that in the back of your mind as you're going through the numbers that we're going to share with you today. Let me begin by some brief background about the sort of bonds of kinship and citizenship that shape Indian American connections to India. This is what our sample looks like. 39% of our respondents are naturalized citizens. These are people who, by and large, were Indian citizens who migrated to the United States and took on American citizenship. 33% are people like myself whose parents were immigrants but are born in the United States. A very slender percentage, just 4%, are Indian Americans who are born in the US to parents who are also born here. So about 77% of the sample are US citizens today. 23% are non-citizens. Now those non-citizens obviously could come from a variety of countries. Almost 90% of them come from India. A smaller share come from places like East Africa, the Caribbean, the United Kingdom, and so on. Now, there is formal citizenship and then there is quasi-citizenship or kinship. We wanted to get into kind of how Indian Americans view these issues beyond just their current status. We asked those who are not US citizens, if given the opportunity, would you like to become a US citizen? 80% of non-citizens said, yes, we would, if given the opportunity, like to become US citizens. Now, most of you will know, some of you may be OCI holders. This is a designation that's made available to people of Indian origin who would like to have a visa-free entry, the ability to work on a permanent basis in India. 42% of our respondents who don't have Indian citizenship possess an OCI card. It's about on par, slightly lower than what official Government of India data suggests. They say about 1 in 2, about 50% of US citizen Indian Americans are OCI holders. One thing we'd like to point out, it's going to be a consistent theme throughout this presentation, is that there is an intergenerational difference. So if you are foreign-born, immigrated to the United States, you are much more likely to have an OCI card. 47% of people in that category do, versus people who are born here, part of the second generation, just 38% possess an OCI card. And this requires a pretty onerous application process for those of you who've been through it. So it's a signifier, I think, of one's connection to India. Now, how do they remain engaged beyond just these bonds of citizenship and kinship? We're going to start here with an overall subjective measure of connectivity. How connected do you personally feel to India? What you'll see here is responses broken up by whether you're born in the United States or born outside of the United States. That is one of the critical determinants of how you respond to this question. You'll see here, 59% of foreign-born Indian Americans say they're either extremely or very connected to India, compared to just 36% of US-born. Conversely, US-born Indian Americans are much more likely to say they're somewhat connected, not too connected, not at all connected. This is, I think, in line with what we'd expect. If you look at other immigrant populations, the second generation tends to have less of a personal or an emotional connection to their ancestral homeland. Now, we look at connectivity more specifically in two ways: personal connectivity and cultural connectivity. So we ask our respondents whether they've engaged in one of the following four types of activities. Have you traveled to India in the past year? Have you supported religious organizations in India in the past year? Have you supported secular nonprofit organizations? And do you communicate regularly with friends and family in India, or do you do none of these things? And what you could see here is that by and large, foreign-born respondents are more likely to engage in these activities, with one exception. So they're more likely to say they've traveled. Now, this is an odd year to ask about travel because of COVID. So we'd expect that these levels are probably depressed. But nevertheless, foreign-born are more likely to have traveled, more likely to communicate by a pretty substantial margin with friends and family in India. The two groups, foreign-born and US-born, are about as equal to have supported nonprofits. But here's something interesting. US-born Indian Americans are more likely to have supported religious organizations in India in the last year. 21% of US-born versus 13% of foreign-born. When you break that up by religion, Hindus and Christians are the most likely. About 20% of them say that they have given. Muslims is slightly less. About a quarter to a third of the sample, depending on how whether you're looking at foreign-born or US-born, say we don't engage in any of these activities in recent times. Looking at cultural connectivity here, you'll notice that both types of Indian Americans, US and foreign-born, are more likely to engage in some of these cultural activities. More likely to have watched Indian movies or television in the last month. Even 1 of every 2 US-born Indian Americans claims to have done this. Identical rates of taking part or enjoying Indian dance, music, or art in the last 6 months. Some of the aunties and uncles who are listening may be happy to know that even US-born Indian Americans, 2/3 of them have reported eating Indian food in the last month. Slightly smaller than foreign-born, and just 12% of the overall sample, again, identical for both groups, say we haven't done any of these activities in recent times. So that gives you a snapshot of kind of personal, cultural, emotional connectivity. Now, how do Indian Americans assess the state of democracy? Before we get into partisan politics, I just want to give you a snapshot of the kind of macro 30,000-foot view. We asked a question which is pretty standard from surveys around the world. Do you feel that things in India are generally going in the right direction, or do you feel things have gone off track? About 36% of our sample on average says that things are on the right track, versus 39% who say things are on the wrong track. About a quarter of the respondents say we don't have an opinion or we don't know. Now you can see here again, foreign-born are slightly more optimistic. US-born are slightly more pessimistic about the trajectory that India is taking today. Just to put this number into context, The identical question was asked in an Ipsos survey of the US and Indian population at large. And what you can see here is pretty interesting. The teal bar shows what we find in our survey, and the blue shows what we find in the Ipsos survey. So 33% of Indian Americans find that the US is on the right track. That's kind of on par with what the American population thinks at large, right? 28%. So pretty pessimistic around the board. That's a real contrast with the views on India, where Indians in India are much more optimistic about the direction India is taking than Indians in the American diaspora. You could see here it's 60% in India to 36% amongst Indian Americans. So that's a pretty stark contrast. We asked another question, which is actually adapted from surveys of Jewish Americans and their relationship to Israel, which is, which of the following best support you? Are you generally pro-India and supportive of the government policies? 17% say yes. Are you generally pro-India, but also critical of some of the Indian government's policies? That's the modal response. 35% say, I'm in this category. Another 23% say we're generally pro-India, but also critical of many of the Indian government's policies. 7%, a pretty small percentage, say we're generally not pro-India at all, and 18% don't profess an opinion. So this is a way of trying to disentangle how people view the country as a whole and the image they have of the country versus the image they have of the government. So, you know, almost 60% of the respondents say they're pro-India, but criticize at least some or many of the current government's policies. When we asked a further question, as you think about India, what are the top challenges India faces today? Government corruption was the #1 response. 18% of Indian Americans say this is the most pressing challenge for India. 15%, the second answer, is the economy. And the third most common answer is religious majoritarianism. Now, if you disaggregate that religious majoritarianism response, you will see, and we'll get to this a little bit later, that Hindus are much less likely to say religious majoritarianism is a challenge facing India than non-Hindus. And we'll touch upon this in a couple of slides. So that's the kind of broad picture on how they view sort of Indian politics. Now, what about partisan politics when it gets to specific parties and leaders? This perhaps is some of the most interesting stuff I think we found. We asked Indian Americans, is there a political party in India you identify with, and what is it? A third of respondents say the BJP, the ruling party of Prime Minister Modi. Just 12%, a pretty small slice, say the Indian National Congress, which of course has been the dominant political party in India for most of the post-47 era. A small clutch of responses in percentage terms give another party, the NCP, the Communist Party, the BSP of Mayawati, the Shiv Sena, and so on and so forth. But interestingly, 40%, 4 out of 10 respondents say we don't actually have an opinion, right? Which suggests that of those who are engaged in politics in India or who stay abreast of issues, very pro-BJP. But a sizable number, right? Almost half say, we don't really have a view on the kind of rough and tumble of Indian politics, which I think is an important thing to sort of keep in mind. Asking specifically here about Prime Minister Modi, do Indian Americans approve or disapprove of the way he's handled his job as Prime Minister? Nearly half of respondents, 48% to be exact, say that they either strongly approve or approve. 31% say that they disapprove. And about 1 in 5 respondents say they don't have a view in either direction, approve or disapprove. One thing to note is if you look at those who approve, that 48%, and those who disapprove, about that 31%, it's about a 16 or 17 point net favorability for Modi. That actually pales in comparison to Modi's net favorability back home in India. This is a tracker that is a weekly tracker undertaken by Morning Consult, a global survey firm. This is actually done for a bunch of leaders around the world, including the United States. You can see here that in India, Modi's approval rating basically is pretty steady around 75 to 80%. His disapproval is pretty steady around 20%. So that's a net favorability of 55 percentage points, right? So much, much larger than the net favorability here in the United States. Now, here we asked a question which is pioneered from the American National Election Studies, where respondents are asked to rate on a scale of 0 to 100 how they rate individual political leaders or organizations. If you go from 51 to 100, that means you're broadly positive. If you're 0 to 49, that means you're broadly negative, and 50 is you're kind of in the middle. Now, we had to first ascertain whether our respondents were aware of these individuals or parties. We can't take that for granted like we could in American context. So the sample sizes are given along the x-axis there. You'll see that people are most familiar with Modi and the BJP compared to, say, the RSS, which only 489 out of our sample of 1,200 were familiar with. But look at the difference in ratings. Indian Americans are much more favorably disposed towards Modi and the BJP, 57 and 58. And then there's a pretty significant drop. The Congress Party and Rahul Gandhi, on that scale of 0 to 100, only get a rating of 38 for Rahul Gandhi, the least popular that we asked about. The Congress is 44. And the RSS, of course, which is a part of the Sangh Parivar associated with the BJP, is somewhere in between. They get a rating of 46 out of 100. Now, how does this compare to how Indian Americans view US political leaders? And that's a really interesting contrast. So what I've shown you here on the left side, in the teal green, are how they rate Indian politicians and parties. On the right side, in dark blue, how they rate American parties and politicians. And there's kind of two things to note. Number one, of course, Indian Americans are more favorably disposed to Democrats. That's well established. They rate Modi and the BJP almost on par, slightly lower with how they rate the Democrats. And amongst Indian Americans, Rahul Gandhi and the Congress are about as popular as the Republican Party and Donald Trump, right? So you see this almost symmetry between their ratings of political leaders in the US and their ratings of political leaders back home in India. So this kind of puts them all on one scale for kind of some comparative context. Now, one of the interesting elements we can do here is, because we've asked about people's political affiliation or their partisan association, how do Democrats and Republicans view these leaders differently? And I think for me anyway, there's one big takeaway, which is that you can see here on Modi and the BJP in particular, Republicans are much more bullish on Narendra Modi, much more favorable, 71 to 55 for Modi, 69 to 55 for the BJP. However, Democrats still are broadly favorable, right? His rating is above a 50. And furthermore, Democrats like Modi and the BJP more than they like Rahul Gandhi and the Congress Party, right? So even though they may not like Modi as much as Republicans, they still favor him over the Congress and Rahul Gandhi, which we found to be quite interesting from this data. Now, one of the questions to get into here is, who is a Modi supporter in the United States, right? There's a lot of conversation about the diaspora and how they feel about Modi. What does it look like demographically? Here are a couple of snapshots. Number one is the youngest Indian Americans tend to be the least supportive of Narendra Modi. You could see here that their approval rating is only at 35. They're more likely to disapprove than approve. And the reverse is true for people who are above the age of 30, right? Modi is much more popular. Very striking religious divide here. 7 in 10 Hindu Indian Americans approve of Modi's performance. Just 1 in 5 Muslims do the same. Christians are somewhere in between, right? So one of the biggest negative net favorability ratings for Modi is amongst Muslims. One of the biggest is for Hindus. Again, I think something probably not all that surprising to those of us on this call who follow Indian politics, but a suggestion that some of the polarization taking place in India is seeping into the views of the diaspora here. Republicans, as I said before, are the most bullish on Modi's performance in office. And last but not least, you know, there's a lot of regional variation in where the Indian diaspora is from, insofar as their home state is concerned in India. Modi's support is greatest among those who speak Hindi or the languages of Western India, specifically Marathi and Gujarati, right? Those really form the most bullish segments of the Indian American population when you break it out by so-called mother tongue. So that's a snapshot of who the Modi supporters in the United States are. Let me move now to the issue of how Indian Americans view contentious policy issues going on in India. Of course, there are a handful that we can think about. This survey was done in the fall, so the farmer protests, unfortunately, hadn't really broken out in the way that we're seeing today, so we weren't able to ask about that, but we're able to ask about a number of other hot button issues. How do people view the All India NRC, this attempt to do a nationwide enumeration of legal residents in order to siphon out those who are quote unquote illegally residing in India? How do people feel about the Citizenship Amendment Act, right? This law that was passed last year, which gives expedited pathway to citizenship to a range of minorities, provided that they don't belong to the Muslim community and come from one of India's neighbors. How do people feel about police force being used against peaceful protesters? How do they feel about the government use of defamation and sedition laws to silence journalists who criticize Modi or his government? And finally, how do they feel about using caste as a factor in Indian university admissions? Now, if you kind of go through these pretty quickly, you have sort of wafer-thin majority support for the NRC. You have similarly a thin majority support for the issue of the Citizenship Amendment Act. 51% of Indian Americans support it. Conversely, almost 60%, excuse me, 65%, sorry, who oppose using police force against peaceful protesters. Almost 70% who oppose the use of defamation and sedition to silence critical journalists, and almost a 50-50 split, a near even split on whether or not caste should be used as a factor in university admissions in India. So this is how they look at issues playing out on the Indian landscape. Now, one of the things we wanted to do here is to ask, okay, can we find similar issues in an American context to see, do Indian Americans have diverging views on issues in the US versus India, or are their views broadly similar? So I'm happy to go more into this in the Q&A, but we selected issues that kind of mirror these same 5 issues. So for instance, on affirmative action, we asked, should race be considered as a factor in American university admissions, just to give you an analog? And then we also asked about just the generic idea, should there be affirmative action without specifying a country-specific context? So for each of these 5 issues, we have an India-specific measure, an American-specific measure, and a general measure of the kind of democratic norm or abstract principle. And here's what we find, that at least in 4 pretty clear cases, people tend to have one view on the generic principle. 90% believe that, yes, we should treat members of all religious groups equally. 87% believe that, we should protect media from censorship. But then people are slightly more conservative when it comes to specific country context, right? So in the US, on the equal treatment of religious minorities, 60% are in favor. But they're even less liberal or more conservative in India, right? Where you see just 49% support that. So Indian Americans tend to hold more liberal views on similar policy issues when it comes to the United States. And on those same issues tend to harbor more conservative views when applied in an Indian context, right? You could see that in the last row with affirmative action. 61% agree with affirmative action in principle. 54% agree with it when applied to the United States, but just 47% agree with it when applied in the Indian context. Now, why might this be going on? One hypothesis we have is, where you sit is where you stand, right? Depending on how you relate to, say, the majority community or the dominant view, you may have different views if you're the majority or the minority. One way of thinking about this is, how do Indian Americans feel about white supremacy in the United States versus Hindu majoritarianism in India? The leftmost column shows the aggregate view. 53% of Indian Americans believe Hindu majoritarianism is a current threat to Indian democracy. 20 percentage points more, 73% believe that white supremacy is a threat in the United States. But you could break this up by religion, and you find pretty instructive responses. Hindus are the least likely to be worried about Hindu majoritarianism, although they're pretty worried about white supremacy in the US. The Muslims, on the other hand, are worried about both threats, majoritarianism in the United States and in India, right? That's the most elevated levels. And Christians are somewhere in between in terms of whether or not they view these issues as threats. So one potential response or explanation is kind of where you sit is where you stand. Coming here to the penultimate section, how do Indian Americans keep informed about news and politics in India? About 56%, give or take, of Indian Americans say that, look, we broadly follow what's happening in terms of government, public affairs back home in India. The question is, how do they stay informed? How do they stay abreast of developments back in India? Which of the following have Indian Americans used in the last week as a source of news about India? Now, I want to point out, we asked specifically as a source of news about India, as opposed to, general entertainment or something like that. 54%, more than half, reported using online sources, 41% for television, 40% for social media, 32% word of mouth, talking to friends, talking to family, talking to contacts, 16% relied on the newspaper, 9% relied on radio, and 13% said none of the above. So pretty heavy emphasis on online sources. There's been a lot of speculation about social media. There's obviously the conventional wisdom is that Indian Americans are spend a lot of time on WhatsApp, for instance, getting information and news about what's happening back home. We wanted to ask, what social media tools Indian Americans rely on most heavily. Actually, the number one response is YouTube, which is something that we weren't expecting. These are people presumably who are watching clips of television programs or other, infomercials, discussions, conversations about what's happening back home in India. Facebook was the second most popular, and WhatsApp was at 38%. So those three kind of cluster as kind of popular outlets when it comes to social media. Then you have a kind of second tier: Instagram, Twitter, Facebook Messenger, and then bringing up the rear, Snapchat and TikTok, which are, of course, newer, more targeted towards younger demographics, millennials, and so on. About a third of Indian Americans respond they don't really use any kind of social media as a source of news. We wanted to ask about how people view mainstream kind of news organizations, right? There's been a lot of talk about biased coverage, whether or not certain outlets don't give either a neutral stance or too pro-government in terms of the Modi government or too anti-Modi government. So we gave people a list of popular news organizations and said, look, on a scale of 0 to 10, how would you rate these sources in terms of their trustworthiness? About, again, news in India, politics and current affairs. The highest rated news outlet is the BBC. On a scale of 0 to 10, Indian Americans gave the BBC a 7.7. CNN was number 2, and interestingly, New York Times was number 3, right? The New York Times is often featured in these conversations as an organization which has it out for India, has an anti-India slant, and so on and so forth, but actually rates pretty highly. Curiously, or interestingly, I should say, the two of the least trusted sources are sources that are seen as relatively pro-Modi government, Aaj Tak and Republic TV. They get a 6.5 and 6.4. Now, the variation is not that huge, right? The spread from 7.7 to 6.4 from the BBC to Republic is not that great. One other thing we asked is, in addition to these name brand sources, how do you trust or how trustworthy is the national government in India, social media, and messaging apps? And those three are, in fact, the least trustworthy in that order. Messaging apps being seen as the least trustworthy source of news and information about politics and current affairs back home in India. Okay, coming here to just the last set of slides here on the issue of foreign policy. How do Indian Americans view U.S.-India relations? You might remember, those of you who saw our October 2020 report on US politics, that US-India relations really weren't that important for the Indian American community in terms of what shaped their vote choice in the 2020 US election. So what I'm showing you here is a kind of ranking. It's a weighed ranking. So we asked for people to give us their number 1 issue, number 2 issue, number 3 issue, and we created a kind of weighted score. And we've, again, broken it out here, not by US born versus foreign born, but citizenship status, which we thought actually might be more informative here. Both groups rate the economy very heavily in terms of the most important issues in the United States. But then we see actually kind of a divergence. US citizens, much more likely to say healthcare, right? Perhaps something that's foreign, sort of non-citizens are less invested in. A huge difference on immigration, right? Which again makes sense. Non-citizens much more likely to harp on the issue of immigration than US citizens who have fewer citizenship concerns or immigration concerns. US-India relations may not be something that noteworthy for the Indian American population at large, but it tends to matter much more if you are a non-citizen. And conversely, an issue like government corruption, something that got a lot of airtime during the Trump administration these past 4 years, US citizens twice as likely to care about this than non-citizens. Let me just see here. Okay, I have one more slide to go, I believe. A couple more slides. Overall US support for India. US-India relations have, sort of gone from strength to strength since the early 2000s. Are we doing enough in the United States to support India? 40% of Indian Americans say our support is about right. 12% say we're actually too supportive. Maybe we should be doing less. 24% say we're not supportive enough. We should be doing more to engage or strengthen relations between the US and India. And about a quarter of the population doesn't have a view, right? And that's pretty consistent on a lot of these questions. You'll see that some not insignificant percentage of Indian Americans, frankly, are just not engaging on these issues, either on foreign policy or on what's happening back home in India. Last finding here is on China. Of course, given recent tensions along the border, along the line of actual control between India and China, and because of the origins of COVID, China has been getting quite a lot of global attention. We find that Indian Americans have quite a unfavorable view of China. About 65% have a either very unfavorable or somewhat unfavorable view of China. Much less likely to have a positive opinion. But the question is, what does that mean for US foreign policy? So we pose the question, when it comes to US-India relations against the backdrop of China, should the United States be helping to strengthen Indian militarily as a check against China? Or should we not provoke China further by strengthening India's military? And what's interesting here is that there does seem to be a difference based on place of birth. US-born Indian Americans are much more cautious about doing something with India that might provoke a Chinese reaction, particularly a military reaction, whereas foreign-born Indian Americans, much more hawkish, right? Much more willing to say, look, we should strengthen India's military as a check against China. I don't have the graph with me, but you will see a similar discrepancy if you look at Democrats and Republicans. Both Democrats and Republicans in the United States, I'm talking here of Indian Americans, have an unfavorable view of China. Democrats, just like US-born Indian Americans, much less hawkish in terms of their overall outlook. So I realize that this is quite a lot of information to digest. I've thrown up here the URL if you're interested in downloading the full report. It's available on the Carnegie Endowment website. I'm going to end the presentation here, but turn it over to Devesh, who's going to just end with some parting thoughts on what we think are some of the big implications and takeaways of this research. Hey, Devesh?
Yep. Uh, I think that they need to start my video.
Can you click there in the bottom left?
Yeah.
There you go.
Okay. So thanks, Milan. I want to just draw 6 broad implications of our findings. So first, while there is strong engagement with and support of India among the diaspora, there is also a significant minority that is either not engaged with or unhappy with developments in India. They reflect 2 main cleavages in the diaspora, religion and place of birth. The political polarization around religion in India is reflected among Indian Americans, especially between Hindus and non-Hindus, particularly Muslims. There is also a clear divide between those born in the US and those born outside. The former is understandably less engaged with India as new generations seek to build their lives in the US. Those born in the US are twice as likely to say they feel more American than Indian than those born outside, and half as likely to say they feel more Indian than American. Now, the effects of these cleavages will depend on several factors. The religious divide will be shaped by developments in India. This is a clear example of what happens in India will not remain in India. On the other hand, the generation divide will in part depend on the demographic balance between US born and non-US born, which in turn will depend on the future of immigration linked to the US. It is evident from our findings that the US born are in general more liberal than their parents, and increasing numbers will be in positions of influence in the years to come. Developments in both India and the US will not only shape the intensity of migration, but also the selection effects on who migrates out of India, who is allowed into the US, and who returns. The composition of Indian migrants will likely reflect increasing numbers from India's marginalized social groups, who now have access to higher education in much greater numbers in India, as well as members of minority religious groups. Both an important but unpredictable factor will be the use of and development of communication technologies, as we've seen recently with the support for the farmer movements in some sections of the diaspora. Even small cleavages or differences will likely be exacerbated and amplified on social media. And this will feed the impression that the Indian American community is perhaps more divided or fragmented than it is in reality. Moreover, global attention to issues and new channels of communication might lead even indifferent respondents to form opinions on issues they have not previously thought about. Fifth, I think it is also important to emphasize that whatever influence Indian Americans exercise, especially on US-India relations, will also significantly depend on other global developments, in particular the India-China, but most of all, the US-China relationship. And finally, the effects of Indian Americans in India will depend on what happens in the United States. A more polarized US with significant political and social challenges will willy-nilly force the attention of the community to domestic challenges within the country that is their new home relatively to the one they came from. With that, we'll now move to take questions. Please use the Q&A function to ask your questions. Thanks. Milan, Sumitra, if you want to come on the video. Okay, so we'll move now to questions which you have put. The first question is from Pratyush Sharma. Were caste dynamics of Indian Americans taken into account for this survey? Sumitra, would you like to take that?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So yes, we did ask demographic questions about which caste identity people identified with. But not only that, we also ask questions about caste discrimination, and we have a whole module on that. Now, the good news is that that's what we're analyzing for our next report. The bad news is that we won't be able to tell you the results today, but that means you should come to our third and final report where we'll have results on caste dynamics.
Just to add a quick thing, I mean, just in broad terms, as we've kind of looked at a distance at this data, as Sumitra said, it'll be the subject of our third report. Relatively small number of Indian Americans, number one, said that they possessed a caste identity. And then number two, revealed what it is. So now there's different ways of interpreting that. Either they truly feel like they don't have a caste identity, or there's some unwillingness to disclose that information, right? There's some kind of social desirability bias. So that's something we're going to try to get into a little bit deeper in the third report, but it is something that we tried to collect data on.
Thanks. The next question is from Vikram Nehru. It's striking, he asks, it's striking that Indian Americans view Kamala Harris slightly less favorably than Joe Biden. What does this signify, if anything? Sumitra?
I just actually checked the numbers on this, and that's not a statistically significant difference. So the slightly was correct. It's so small that it's not a real difference.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Sumitra. Milan, you wanted to add anything?
Well, I mean, I would just say that I think broadly Indian Americans seem to put most Democratic Party leaders around the same kind of mid-60s rating, right? That they all kind of cluster around that level. You're right, though, that there doesn't seem to be kind of putting Kamala Harris on a pedestal where she's getting, 70s or 80s. In the first report, we did find, however, that she did have a significant mobilizational effect on Indian Americans. So it did help them get excited about voting, and disproportionately got them excited about voting for the Biden ticket. And when you ask them, why is it that she makes you excited about the Biden ticket? The number one response was because of her Indian heritage above all else.
Thanks. This question is from Jashan Bajwa, and she asks, within partisan identity, were there any differences between the US born and the foreign born?
I can answer this question.
Yeah.
Thank you for this question. So actually, yes, there are some pretty stark differences in partisan identity based off of place of birth. So if you remember, the original graph said about 32% of people supported the BJP, 12% for the Congress, and 40% said they did not have a partisan identity or opinion. Now, if you look at just the US-born respondents, the 32% who said that they supported the BJP in the overall sample, this number goes down to 17%. So about cut halfway through. Congress, which was at 12% previously for the whole sample, goes up to 15%. But the biggest change is that for US-born respondents, the percent of people answering don't know goes up by 10 percentage points. So it was about 4 in 10 respondents for the whole sample. For just US-born respondents, it's about 5 in 10 respondents. So 1 in 2, 50% of the sample says they don't know. Now, if you compare this to people who were not born in the US, the percentage supporting the BJP goes up to about 40%. So higher than the overall average. Congress remains about the same, but the don't knows come down. Now it's about 34%. So I guess the big takeaway from this is that US-born respondents are more likely to not say that they identify a party, but when they do, they're less likely to say that they identify with the BJP.
Thanks, Sumitra. Milan, you wanted to add something?
No,
Okay. The next question is from Vidisha Biswas. Would it be accurate to conclude then that Modi and the BJP remain popular with respondents while many of their authoritarian policies are not? Or Milan?
Yeah, I'll start and then you guys can jump in. Thanks, Vidisha. Good to see you here. I think that's broadly correct, right? That Indian Americans do seem, on average, to have a favorable opinion of the Prime Minister and his performance in office. However, when you poll them on specific policies, there's not necessarily overwhelming support for any of the initiatives we asked about. Now, we didn't ask about everything. We didn't ask about farmers. We didn't ask about 370 in Kashmir, right? I mean, there are lots of things we would have liked to have asked about. And, you know, there is a puzzle generally, I think, about, you know, what explains this level of support for Modi. I mean, if you go back to the graph on Modi's support in India, and you compare that to the support for Bolsonaro, the support for Trump, and now Biden, for Boris Johnson, you will find that favorability rating for Modi is higher than any other leader that gets polled by Morning Consult, right? So Indians have given Modi pretty wide berth, I think, in terms of implementing his agenda without necessarily overly scrutinizing or holding him accountable on any one specific policy. That's my view. And I think Indian Americans have largely followed that same kind of pattern. But Devesh, Sumitra, please jump in if you have a different view.
Sumitra, why don't you?
The only thing I would add to that, Milan, is that in terms of the percentages that approve of Modi and the percentages that support some of these policies, there isn't actually a great load of difference. So about 49% of the sample say that they support Modi. 45% are opposed to the NRC, 49% are opposed to the CAA. So there isn't that much of a difference actually in people who support Modi and people who support his policies. The only difference for me that stood out was that a pretty significant chunk of the sample said that they did not have an opinion on Modi himself, but they might be willing to profess an opinion on these policy attitudes. So in a sense, those may be more salient than the person himself.
Thanks. The next question is from Professor Pavitra Suryanarayan. She's curious about the caste and gender dynamics among respondents. Did they correlate with BJP or Republican Party support? Sumitra, do you want to take that? And then Milan, you can add.
Yeah, Milan said some things about caste, so I'll focus on gender. So there are actually some significant and interesting gender dynamics going on in this sample. So with respect to the policy issues, we're finding that men are substantially more likely to support police force against peaceful protesters. They're also slightly more likely to support the CAA and the NRC, but there aren't any gender differences on support or approval for Prime Minister Modi. There are also some significant gender differences with respect to parties. So remember, I talked earlier about the 40% who said that they did not have a partisan identity. That breaks in a very interesting way. So of that 40%, 24 percentage points are likely to be women and only 16 are likely to be men. So that's an interesting gender dynamic. But in terms of support for the Congress or the BJP, there isn't much of a difference based off of gender.
Milan, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I thank you for the question, Pavi. I think on caste, you know, we'll get back to you based on our analysis. But again, just to give you some broad headlines, you know, we have a sample of 1,200 respondents. 600, so almost 50%, didn't respond to the question of whether or not they personally identified with the caste, right? So you take 50% of the sample out. Of the remaining 50%, it's split. Half of them said, I do have a caste identity, and the other half said, I don't. So then if you dig deeper into the half of the half, now you're getting to smaller numbers. The overwhelming majority, about 80%, identified with the upper caste or general caste category. So one of the things we'll do in the final report is to look, albeit with a very reduced sample size, at how caste identity correlates. I should just add that one of the things specifically we will be looking at, and I know that it's been an issue of interest to a lot of people, not least in the press and the media, is the question of discrimination, including on caste grounds, and whether or not people feel like this is a major issue and if they've been personally victimized. So, stay tuned for more on that.
Thanks. The next question is from Rupinder, from Rupinder Lidar. And the question is, I was just wondering how you predict the religious breakdown and support would look among Indian Americans towards the recent farmer protests, especially given how they feel more conservative towards issues occurring in India than in the United States. Shall I just take a crack and then you guys can add?
Yeah, sure.
So, the farmer protests are really confined to a part of Northwest India, which is farmers from Punjab, Haryana, and Western UP. These are the most privileged farmer groups among all farmers in India. Punjab in particular also has, from these farming communities, there's been a lot of migration, both to the UK, Canada, and the US, especially among Sikhs. And we can see that there's a lot of support in this community for the farmer protests. Our sample, however, unfortunately, didn't have enough sample size of Sikhs for us to include that in our analysis. It just wouldn't have been very robust. So which is why we did not include that in our analysis. Sumitra, Milan, you want to add anything?
Sumitra, go ahead.
No, I like that answer.
Okay.
Okay. The next question is from Krishna Vavilala. This is Black History Month. Did you survey attitudes of Indian Americans towards the Black community? If so, any findings?
It's a very good question. Good to see you here, Krishna Uncle. We don't have much to say on this. In the third report, one of the things we did ask about when it comes to the social realities of Indian Americans is this question of discrimination, and whether or not Indian Americans perceive discrimination that they might experience to be greater or less than that of other Asian Americans, of African Americans, of LGBTQ Americans. And so that's something that we're reporting back on. But because this was really focused more on how they view India, we don't have anything specifically on African Americans here.
Thanks, Milan. The next question is from Abhishek Bhati, who asks, I'm curious about why there is a difference between the likability of PM Modi among Indian Americans versus Indians.
Devesh, you should answer that. I asked you the same question yesterday.
Well, I think two reasons are quite apparent. One is the religious composition of Indian Americans is quite different from the religious composition of India. There are more minority religions as a fraction of the Indian American population than their share in the Indian population. And the minority religions in India have a less favorable view of Prime Minister Modi. The second is the second generation among Indian Americans, those who were born in the US, they have also less favorable views on Prime Minister Modi. And I think these two explain most, but perhaps not all, of this gap. Sumitra, do you want to add? Okay. Milan, you want to add?
No.
Okay. The next question is from Krishnan Hariyara. Anything that surprised you sufficiently that to make you go back and check your data?
I'll take that. I was actually surprised at the quite divided response of the diaspora on the question of India's overall trajectory, right? I think the impression that one gets from conversations, from social media and so on and so forth, watching scenes like Howdy Modi, is that the diaspora is relatively favorably disposed to the way India is headed. And you get a much more mixed picture, frankly, when you look at the diaspora in totality, looking at young, old, men, women, Muslims, Hindus, immigrants and US born. And, that was really one of the objectives at the outset, was to say, we have had surveys on how Indians view America. We've had surveys on how Americans view India, but we've never had a survey on how Indian Americans view India. And so this is, I think, a modest attempt to try to lay down a marker that we can now compare things to over time. The second thing that surprised me, frankly, was how poorly the Congress Party rated, right? I mean, after all, this was the party which has been in power for most of India's post-47 history. And to see, frankly, how poorly both Rahul Gandhi and the Congress Party rated relative to the BJP. I had no doubt that the BJP would emerge as the most popular political party for the diaspora. But I think that's actually a very troubling sign for the Congress Party in terms of diaspora support, in terms of how they think about the Congress Party's future prospects. So that's something I had not expected to see fully.
Mitra, anything you want to add? Anything surprised you?
One of the things for me that a lot of things surprised me. For me, one of the things that was the most surprising was this question about people's media use and which channels they like. And we were discussing this in a conversation yesterday. Some of the least trustworthy sources for this sample are Aaj Tak and Republic TV. And we know that these are channels that are more likely to be favorable towards the Modi government. And we know that this is a sample that is more likely approves of Modi. So the idea of what's going on behind the fact that this is a sample that likes Modi, watches Republic TV, but trusts it the least was, I think, something that was interesting to me and something that in future research merits some investigation into the mechanisms of what's going on.
Krishnan, nothing surprises me about the world anymore. So, so nor did this survey. So the next question is from Anupam Anna. What, if anything, changes if you correct by education and or relative income levels? I'll just take the first and then you guys can add on education. So Anupam, there are three ways to think about education. One is the level of education. The second is the type of education. And the third is the location of education, meaning India or the US. On the level of education, we find that in general, and this is if you take age 25 or above, which is when most people have finished their college education, those with a college education have relatively more liberal attitudes than those who don't have a college education. The type of education is interesting. Those who had an engineering education are much more likely to be pro-Modi. The place of education, in the past, we found that if you have a terminal degree in the US, you are more likely to be liberal. That we haven't yet checked, and we'll be able to do so in the next few weeks. On income or on education, so Sumitra, you want to add? And then Milan.
I can add a finding on income, which is that we basically disaggregated income into three categories. Those who said they earned below $50,000 a year, 50 to 100,000, and above 100,000. Now, for all three of these categories, on average, people really like Prime Minister Modi. But surprisingly, for the category of people who earn above $100,000 a year, they tend to disapprove slightly more than the other categories. Milan, do you want to add anything?
No, I would just say, just to echo something that Devesh said, there are very few categories of Indian Americans who give an approval rating for Modi above 60%. But here are the groups. They are Hindus, they are Republicans, they are Hindi speakers, Gujarati/Marathi speakers, and last but not least, engineers. Engineers are significantly more likely, even controlling for the level of education, to support Mr. Modi, which is funny because it's actually something which has been talked about anecdotally in India in terms of who makes up part of his core voter support. So that's something which is borne out in our data. Engineering here, I should mention, has a broad definition. It includes engineers, computer scientists, and architects.
The next question is from Aidan Millif. Aidan asks, do any of these trends vary based on what region of India respondents or their parents, grandparents are from? So we have the finding by language, and Milan, do you want to take that?
So we haven't, thanks, Aidan. It's a great question. We haven't looked at this fully yet, but again, it's something that we're going to look at more specifically in the third report, where we're going to look at two aspects. So one is what your mother tongue is. That's kind of what we've shown you here in this one question. The second is whether or not there's a specific home state that you call home, or are there multiple states, right? To sort of look at that. Now, obviously, those two things are likely to be correlated. But for questions other than approval of Modi, we have not looked at variation by region of origin in India.
Thanks. The next question is again from Krishna Vavilala. Did the survey inquire into how Indian Americans have been seeing the phenomenon of Trudeau and Kamala and Meena Harris being the experts on Indian agriculture? So I think it's an excellent question. However, this expertise has emerged quite recently. And our survey was conducted in September. So this we don't have an answer like for you on this one.
I would just as a broader point, Devesh, you made this point already, but I just want to emphasize it. And we have an op-ed in the Hindustan Times tomorrow bringing this out, that as the polarization in India deepens, what happens in India doesn't necessarily stay in India, right? That it is seeping into the views, the politics, the thinking of the diaspora. And given the rise of digital technology, social media on the one hand, and the second, the fact that, look, in the United States, there are multiple entry points at which you can influence policy, right? It's not just the executive branch and the State Department. The Capitol Hill, as all of you know, plays a very large role. And of course, the NGO community, and then has an indirect impact. And so even where differences and cleavages may be relatively small, we can expect that going forward that some of those differences are going to be magnified and exacerbated and amplified because of these two trends, right? And so I think there has been a feeling amongst people who have studied the Indian diaspora that the group has been relatively homogenous in its view. It's been a real bridge builder in terms of how it relates or brings the US and India together. That sort of unity of relative, or what we've thought of unity of thinking, clarity of purpose, whatever you want to call it, is likely to be much more fragmented, we think, going forward, right? And maybe what we're seeing with Mina Harris and others is an example of that.
Thanks, Milan. The next question is from Professor Hamita Gupta, and she asks, does profession type such as teacher, physician, small business owner, IT professional impact preferences?
It's we just answered this in another way. So engineers, as Milan said, are significantly more likely to show their approval and support for Modi as compared to non-engineers. But we haven't actually checked the impact of profession on other policy attitudes. This is something we can do going forward.
So just to add to Sumitra, Hamita, we've tried to separate education, the type of education, engineer, healthcare, a physician, etc., from occupation, because, you could be an engineer like me and doing this type of work, or you could be an engineer working in a tech company. So we've done the education part. We haven't yet been able to do on the occupation part. In part, the sample sizes begin to get quite small because of the range of occupations. And but we intend to do that now. And once we do that, we'll take that back to you.
Devesh, I think we have just about a couple minutes. Do you want to just take one or two more?
So I'll take from those who haven't. There's some who already asked one. So, there's one from Professor Paul Staniland. He's saying, I was wondering if you might be willing to speculate about the relative weight of different variables in table 15, which refers to Modi approval, i.e., what does all this look like in a multi-causal world?
We put a bunch of these variables into one regression actually to see which of them was still significant. And we found that approval of Modi is significantly correlated with being Hindu, being an older respondent, so 30 years old. And there was no difference by gender. These were the variables that stood out in a multi-regression. Correct me, Milan, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I think that's right. So basically, Paul, this is not the last word, but just an initial cut. Yeah. If you look at approval of Modi as the kind of outcome variable, and you look at some of these demographic characteristics, college educated, much more likely to support Modi. There's actually no gender difference at all that's significant. Hindus, much more likely, Muslims less likely, that's not a surprise. US born, significantly less likely. And again, the age thing is a big divide. In fact, after religion, that seems to be the second most significant in terms of the magnitude of the effect, that the older you are, the more likely you are to support Modi. Although, if you just look at the descriptive statistics, there's a bit of a nonlinear effect. In other words, it's really the middle group, the people who are kind of in their 30s, 40s, 50s, who are the most supportive of Modi. And then actually Modi's support dips again slightly as you get to the group above 56, who are people who typically have come to the United States much earlier.
So this would be our last question. It's from Ketaki Zodgekar. The question is, do you have any findings on Indian American members of the US Congress and wider Indian American politicians, their attitudes towards Indian politics? That's a great question. Wish we knew. Our survey, of course, was not aimed at that small group, but it's one that would indeed be very interesting, like to know.
I would just add, Ketaki, that if you're interested in this question, it's not a full answer, but it does give you some interesting insights. Drumil Mehta from 538.com had a very interesting piece that came out last week on the political contributions of Indian Americans, as well as who Indian American members of Congress and candidates raise money from. and it does shed light a little bit on the views towards the diaspora, and in at least a couple of cases on India. So I would refer you to that. It was published last week on 538, but we have not looked at this more widely, although I think you've given us a great idea for a follow-on project, because I think this could easily be pulled off.
I know we have a few other questions. I think we've answered some of that in different forms. We are sort of run out of time. I just want to thank you all for joining us and being patient while we try to answer your questions. I especially want to thank Milan and Sumitra for this amazing project that I've been fortunate to be part of. And I hope you will stay tuned for our third and last report on this survey, which, as Milan said, we hope to have it out in about 2 to 3 months' time. So thank you all, and please do write to us if you have any questions, and we'll do our best to answer them. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.